They say hardship builds character, but they rarely speak about what it quietly takes in return. Because sometimes what looks like strength on the outside is simply what remains after something softer was slowly worn away. Like a river carving through stone, not with force but with repetition, hunger, uncertainty, silence. What happens to a child who learns too early that there might not be enough? Enough food, enough safety, enough tomorrow. What happens when survival becomes the first language you ever understand? The Great Depression is often remembered in numbers in history books, in black and white photographs of long lines and empty shelves, but beneath those images lived something far more intimate, a quiet psychological imprint, a way of seeing the world that didn't fade when the economy recovered. Because some fears don't leave when circumstances change. They settle, they root, they become part of how a person exists. And even decades later they echo. This is not just a story about poverty. It is a story about how scarcity reshapes the human mind. Let's begin. There is a quiet assumption most children carry before they even have words for it. That the world is stable. That tomorrow will arrive in the same shape as today. That the adults around them know what they're doing. It is not something they are taught. It is something they feel. A kind of invisible ground beneath their feet. But what happens when that ground begins to crack? Not suddenly. Not with a loud collapse. But slowly. Quietly. A parent's voice changes. A table that was once full becomes uncertain. Conversations become hushed. Doors close a little more often. And the child notices. Not in the way adults do, with explanations and logic, but in fragments, in sensations. Something is wrong. Something is missing. Something is no longer safe. Because security for a child is not built on facts. It is built on patterns. The rhythm of meals. The predictability of routine. The emotional tone of the home. And when those patterns begin to break, the mind does not ask why. It asks something much simpler. Can I still trust this world? During the Great Depression, this question was not theoretical. It lived in empty cupboards, in unpaid bills, in the quiet tension between adults trying to hold things together. But perhaps the most invisible part was what happened inside the child. Because when stability disappears early in life, the brain begins to reorganize itself around uncertainty. Not as a temporary state, but as a new normal. You begin to watch more closely, to listen more carefully, to read between the lines. You learn that things can change without warning. That what exists today might not exist tomorrow. And so something subtle begins to form. A kind of internal alertness. Not panic, not yet, but a quiet, constant awareness that nothing is guaranteed. And this awareness does something profound. It shifts the role of the child. Instead of simply being, you begin to monitor. Instead of trusting, you begin to anticipate. You notice the way your parents exchange glances, the hesitation before spending money, the small sacrifices made without explanation. And even if no one says it out loud, you understand, there isn't enough. And in that moment, something foundational begins to change. Because children are not meant to carry the weight of survival. They are meant to explore, to play, to feel safe enough to be uncertain. But when survival enters too early, it rewrites the script. You begin to shrink your needs, to ask for less, to want less, not because you are told to, but because you feel the cost of wanting. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world becomes a place that must be managed, not trusted. This is where the first fracture begins, not in the environment itself, but in the relationship to it. Because when security disappears during childhood, the mind does not simply remember the event. It adapts to it. It becomes cautious, observant, prepared. And while these qualities may look like maturity, they are often something else. A response to instability. A quiet attempt to create safety in a world that no longer feels predictable. And even years later, long after the crisis has passed, that early imprint remains, not as a memory, but as a feeling, a subtle hesitation, a background awareness, a question that never fully leaves. What if it happens again? There is a difference between experiencing scarcity and becoming shaped by it. Because sometimes, even when the cupboards are no longer empty, the mind still behaves as if they are. Scarcity at first is an external condition, a moment in time, a phase that passes. But when it lingers long enough, it begins to move inward. It becomes a way of seeing, a quiet filter placed over everything. And once that filter forms, it does not simply disappear when circumstances change. For a child growing up during the Great Depression, lack was not occasional. It was consistent. Meals were uncertain. Opportunities were limited. Stability felt fragile. And the brain, designed to adapt, began to learn something very specific. There might not be enough. Not just today, but in general. And this belief does not stay confined to food or money. It expands. It touches everything. Time, energy, love, safety. Because when not enough becomes familiar, it begins to feel like the natural state of the world. And so even when life slowly improves, even when there is more available, the mind hesitates. It questions, is this real? Will it last? Can it disappear again? This is how scarcity thinking is born. Not through a single moment, but through repetition, through days that felt uncertain, through needs that went unmet, through a world that didn't always provide. And over time, the brain begins to prioritize one thing above all else: preservation. Psychologically, this shift is quiet but powerful. Attention narrows. Focus sharpens around what is missing, what could be lost. You begin to notice risks more than possibilities, loss more than gain. Not because you are pessimistic, but because your mind has learned that survival depends on vigilance. And this creates a subtle distortion. Even when there is enough, it doesn't always feel like enough. Even when things are stable, they don't always feel secure. Because the reference point has changed. Security is no longer measured by what is present, but by what could be taken away. And so the mind begins to hold on, to save, to store, to prepare, not out of greed, but out of memory. A memory that lives beneath awareness. A memory that says, you've seen how quickly things can disappear. This is why scarcity thinking is not easily undone. It is not just a belief that can be reasoned with. It is a pattern that was once necessary, a form of protection. Because during the Depression, this way of thinking kept people alive. It made them cautious, careful, resourceful. But what once protected can quietly persist long after the danger has passed. And so, even in moments of abundance, there can still be a sense of holding back, a reluctance to fully relax, to fully trust. Because somewhere deep beneath the surface, the mind is still asking the same question: what if this isn't permanent? And in that question, scarcity continues to exist. Not in the world, but within it. There is a quiet phrase that often lives beneath the surface of survival. Just in case. It doesn't sound urgent. It doesn't sound fearful. But it carries something deeper. A memory of what it felt like when there wasn't enough. For those who grew up during the Great Depression, this phrase became a way of living. You save things just in case. You reuse just in case. You avoid waste just in case. Not because you expect disaster, but because you remember it. And memory, when it is tied to survival, does not fade easily. It lingers. It shapes behavior in ways that may seem excessive, even unnecessary to those who did not live through it. Why keep items that are no longer needed? Why hesitate to spend even when there is more than enough? Why feel discomfort in moments of ease? Because the mind is not responding to the present. It is responding to what it learned. Psychologically, this pattern is rooted in something known as loss aversion. The idea that losing something, feels more intense than gaining something of equal value. And for a child who experienced real loss, this sensitivity becomes amplified. Because loss was not theoretical. It was lived. Food disappeared. Money disappeared. Stability disappeared. And so, the brain begins to prioritize one thing above all else. Don't lose what you have. Even if what you have is small. Even if holding on begins to create tension. Because the fear of loss outweighs the comfort of having. This is where behaviors like hoarding begin to take shape. Not as a disorder, not as irrationality, but as an extension of protection. Each saved item becomes a small reassurance, a buffer against uncertainty, a quiet promise that next time, you might be prepared. And even when those items are no longer useful, letting them go can feel like letting go of safety itself. Because the object is no longer just an object. It is a symbol of preparedness, of control, of survival. But this pattern does not stop at physical things. It extends into emotions. You begin to hold back joy just in case. You limit your desires just in case. You avoid taking risks just in case. Because wanting more can feel dangerous. What if it's taken away? What if it doesn't last? And so something subtle begins to happen. You don't just protect your resources. You protect your expectations. You learn not to reach too far. Not to rely too much. Not to assume stability. Because the cost of disappointment once felt too heavy. This is the quiet weight of never enough. Not always visible. Not always spoken. But present. In the hesitation before spending. In the instinct to save beyond necessity. In the discomfort that arises even in abundance. And while it may appear as discipline, or carefulness, or even wisdom, at its core, it is something else. A mind that learned, through experience, that having something today does not guarantee having it tomorrow. And so it holds on, not out of excess, but out of memory. A memory that still whispers, "Be careful, you've seen how quickly it can all disappear." Some experiences do not end. When the moment passes, they continue. Not in the same form, but in quieter ways. In habits, in beliefs, in the way a person moves through the world. And sometimes, they are passed on. The Great Depression did not only shape those who lived through it. It shaped the environments they later created. Homes where caution was valued, where saving was emphasized, where waste was quietly discouraged. But more than that, it shaped the emotional tone of those homes. Because children do not only learn from what is said, they learn from what is felt. The pauses before spending, the careful planning, the subtle tension around uncertainty. Even without explanation, these signals are absorbed. And over time, they begin to make sense. You may grow up hearing phrases like, "Always have something set aside. Don't take unnecessary risks. Be careful with what you have." And on the surface, these sound like practical advice. Responsible, grounded, but beneath them, there is often something deeper. A memory that is not your own. A memory of instability, of uncertainty, of what it felt like when things were not enough. Psychologically, this is how patterns are carried forward. Not through direct transmission, but through repetition. Through consistent exposure to certain ways of thinking, certain ways of reacting. And gradually, those ways begin to feel natural, familiar, even if the original reason behind them is no longer present. This is why someone can grow up in relative stability and still feel a quiet sense of caution. Why abundance can feel uncertain. Why security can feel temporary. Because the emotional blueprint was shaped before them, inherited without being consciously chosen. This transmission is not always visible. It exists in small moments. The hesitation before making a purchase. The importance placed on saving. The tendency to prepare for what might go wrong. And even an emotional expression. A preference for composure. A reluctance to share vulnerability. A quiet endurance. Because these patterns were once necessary. And what is necessary often becomes tradition. But there is something important to understand. These inherited patterns are not mistakes. They are reflections of what was lived, of what was survived. They carry within them a kind of wisdom, a memory of resilience, of adaptation. But they also carry something else, a continuation of a mindset that was shaped in a different time. And so the past does not disappear. It softens, it shifts, but it remains present in the way people think, in the way they feel, in the way they relate to the world, sometimes without realizing it. This is how history becomes personal, not just through events, but through patterns, through the quiet inheritance of beliefs that once served a purpose, and even now continue to shape perception, to influence decisions, to guide behavior, all from something that was experienced long before. And somewhere within this quiet transmission, there is a subtle awareness that not everything being carried originated from the present, that some thoughts, some reactions, some feelings are echoes of a time when survival required a different way of seeing the world. And those echoes still remain. There is a way history is often remembered. Through events, through dates, through outcomes, recovery, rebuilding, return to normal. But there is another way history exists. One that is quieter. It lives in what was not restored. Because when a child grows up in scarcity, what is lost is not always visible. It is not something that can be counted or measured. It is something felt, a kind of softness that never fully had the chance to exist. The ease of not worrying, the freedom of not anticipating loss, the ability to trust without hesitation. These are not dramatic losses. They do not announce themselves, but they leave a shape, a quiet absence. And yet, life continues. People grow. They build. They create stability where there was once none. They become providers, caregivers, protectors. And from the outside, it looks like everything was overcome, like the past was left behind. But beneath that surface, something remains. Not as pain, not always, but as a way of being. A certain carefulness, a quiet restraint, a subtle distance from ease. This is not something to fix. It is something to understand. Because every pattern, every habit, every quiet hesitation carries a story of adaptation, of learning how to survive in a world that once felt uncertain. And that story deserves to be seen, not judged, not corrected, but acknowledged. There is also something deeply human within this. Because despite what was lost, something else was created. Endurance, resourcefulness, the ability to continue even when things were difficult. And these qualities are not small. They are the result of experience, of navigating something that required strength, even when strength was not chosen. But perhaps the most important part is allowing both things to exist at once. The strength and the cost, the resilience and the quiet absence it may carry. Because understanding is not about choosing one over the other. It is about holding both, gently, without resistance. And when that happens, something shifts, not in the past, but in how the past is held. There is less tension, less need to justify or explain, just a quiet recognition that what was experienced shaped something real, something lasting, and maybe that recognition itself is enough, not to change what was, but to soften the way it lives on, to create space for compassion, for yourself, for others, for the unseen stories that continue to shape the present. If this reflection felt familiar, if parts of it seemed to echo something you couldn't quite name, then maybe something quiet inside you was simply being recognized. Because not every pattern you carry started with you. And not every feeling needs to be explained. To be valid, there are histories that live beneath behavior, stories that exist without words, and you are not alone in carrying them. If you like to stay connected to this kind of space, a space where we slowly explore the hidden corners of the human mind, you're welcome to remain here. And if you feel comfortable sharing, you can leave a thought below. Not because you have to, but because sometimes, your words might help someone else feel a little less alone. Take care of yourself.